My friends, we live in a world filled with light, yet overshadowed by darkness. The Bible warns us that evil walks among us, seeking to destroy, deceive, and devour. While many dismiss the existence of demons as mere superstition, Scripture tells us plainly that spiritual warfare is real. Today, I want to share with you 6 undeniable signs that someone may be under the influence of a dark spirit, so that you may be vigilant, steadfast, and victorious in faith. They reject truth and embrace lies. A person influenced by darkness cannot stand the truth. They twist words, distort facts, and deceive others with cunning speech. The enemy has always been a liar from the beginning, and those under his influence follow in his footsteps. They carry an unnatural hatred for righteousness. You will notice that they detest goodness. They scoff at morality, mock holiness, and despise those who walk in faith. Their hearts are filled with contempt for anything that brings glory to God. They seek to corrupt others. A demonic spirit is never content being alone. It desires to spread its poison. It will lure the innocent into sin, encouraging rebellion against God's commands. They take delight in leading others down the path of destruction. They display supernatural disturbances. The presence of evil is sometimes revealed through unnatural means, unexplained shadows, eerie sensations, unshakable dread. When darkness moves, it often leaves behind an unsettling trace, stirring fear and confusion. They manifest uncontrollable rage and destruction. Violence, anger, and cruelty mark the footprints of the enemy. A person influenced by darkness will often be filled with an unrelenting hatred, a desire to harm, and a thirst for destruction. This is not the Spirit of God, for His Spirit is of love, peace, and self-retrieval. They reject deliverance and mock the name of the Lord. A sure sign of demonic influence is an absolute refusal to turn toward God. They will scoff at His name, resist prayer, and even lash out against those who offer spiritual help. This is because the enemy trembles at the power of the Almighty. But let me tell you this, my friends, the power of God is far greater than the forces of darkness. No demon, no wicked spirit, no agent of evil can stand against the name of Jesus. If you ever encounter such darkness, do not fear, for the Lord is your shield, your fortress, and your deliverer. Stand firm in faith, walk in righteousness, and you will overcome. Evil in all its insidious forms operates under the guise of something reasonable, something rational, something even noble. That's the truly dangerous aspect of it. It doesn't present itself as some grotesque, malevolent force with horns and a pitchfork. It emerges in subtler ways, slipping into the cracks of our social structures, our conversations, even our own minds. The truly deceptive thing about malevolence is that it often masquerades as virtue. And that's why understanding the enemy is crucial. If you cannot identify when something is working against you, against the good, the true, and the beautiful, then you are vulnerable to its influence, perhaps even complicit in it. History has shown us time and time again that malevolence, whether individual or societal, rarely announces itself for what it truly is. People who become corrupted don't wake up one morning and decide to serve evil. No, they justify every small step along the way, convincing themselves that what they are doing is necessary, even righteous. When lies replace truth and deception replaces honesty, it isn't done with flashing neon signs. It's done through whispers, rationalizations, and a slow descent into chaos. And that's why you need to learn to recognize the signs. Imagine for a moment that you encounter someone who is perpetually dishonest, not just in the small, forgettable ways that people sometimes are when they want to avoid social conflict, but in a way that is foundational. They lie even when the truth would serve them better. They manipulate facts, distort reality, and seem almost compelled to lead others into confusion. You can observe this pattern in people who have completely abandoned a fundamental structure of order in their lives. They no longer regard truth as the highest aim. They regard power as the highest aim. And so they twist truth to suit whatever narrative benefits them most. Now, what happens when you expose that kind of person to the truth? They recoil, they lash out, they reject it with a fury that seems almost irrational. This is because a person steeped in malevolence cannot coexist with truth. Truth is corrosive to deceit. It burns through it, exposing everything rotten underneath. And that exposure is intolerable for those who have built their entire existence on a false foundation. That's why corrupt individuals react to truth not with curiosity or self-reflection, but with anger and dismissal. They must. Otherwise, they risk the entire structure of their existence crumbling around them. This is also why deception is often accompanied by an attack on meaning itself. When you destroy the idea of truth, when you insist that nothing is objectively real and that everything is a mere matter of perception, then people become unmoored. If there is no ultimate reality, then how can one distinguish between good and evil? How can one even decide what is worth pursuing? This is one of the most dangerous intellectual traps that exists. The idea that truth is merely subjective. It sounds liberating at first, but in practice it leads only to chaos. If everything is equally valid, then nothing is valid. If nothing is valid, then power becomes the only thing left to pursue. You see this in systems that fall apart. When a culture abandons truth, what follows is an erosion of meaning. And what follows that is suffering, real suffering. You see this in individuals as well. When a person gives up on truth, they begin to justify any action, no matter how destructive. They start to manipulate those around them, drawing others into their games of deceit, because deceit is lonely and it craves validation. Misery loves company, but so does corruption. That's why malevolence seeks to expand. It isn't content with its own destruction. It seeks to pull others down as well. One of the surest signs of this process is the increasing inability to handle responsibility. A person who has embraced deception does not want accountability, because accountability demands truth. And so they avoid it. They blame others. They externalize every failing and every shortcoming. This is another classic feature of malevolence. It refuses to look inward. It sees every problem as an external force to be fought, never something to be corrected within the self. That is why people who fall into this pattern become so combative, so bitter, so hostile toward anything that threatens their narrative. They must remain victims, because victims are never required to change. Now, if you follow this thread long enough, you reach something very dark. You reach the point where the person doesn't just lie to others, they lie to themselves. And that is where malevolence truly takes root. A person who lies to themselves no longer even knows the truth. They have blinded themselves entirely, and once that happens, the road back is almost impossible. That's why it is so critical to recognize these patterns early before they spiral beyond redemption. So what can be done? What is the antidote to this kind of corruption? The answer is as simple as it is difficult. Seek the truth, no matter how painful. Speak the truth, no matter how costly. Hold to the truth, even when every force around you urges you to abandon it. Truth is the only thing strong enough to push back against malevolence, because malevolence cannot exist in the presence of real, unshakable truth. You must decide then whether you will be an agent of truth or an agent of deception. There is no neutral ground. If you do not actively stand for truth, you will be swept away by falsehood. And that is how you begin to truly understand the enemy, not as some distant external force, but as something that works in quiet, creeping ways. The battle is fought in every conversation, in every choice, in every moment where you decide whether to stand for what is real or to let deception take hold. You might think the cost of truth is too high, that it is easier to go along with things, to avoid the discomfort of confrontation. But the cost of deception is far greater, because eventually what is false collapses. And when it does, it takes everything with it. There's something profoundly unsettling about the way evil presents itself, not as something obviously grotesque or monstrous, but as something that often appears justified, rational, even admirable. That's what makes it so dangerous. You see, genuine malevolence doesn't typically walk through the front door and announce its arrival. It doesn't wear a label that says, "I am destructive." Instead, it creeps in slowly, insidiously, wearing a mask of righteousness. It convinces itself and others that what it's doing is not only acceptable but necessary. That's why an unnatural hatred for righteousness is such a strong indicator of a deeper, more sinister force at play. It starts subtly. You might notice it in the way someone speaks about goodness, about virtue, about anything that represents order and discipline. At first, it's just cynicism, an eye roll, a sarcastic remark, a casual dismissal of those who try to live rightly. But cynicism is never harmless. It spreads like a virus, growing into resentment, and resentment, when left unchecked, turns into something much darker. It turns into hatred. And not just any kind of hatred, but a deep, visceral contempt for anything that resembles righteousness, discipline, truth, or beauty. Now you might ask, why would someone hate goodness? It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Why would anyone despise integrity, honesty, kindness, and self-discipline? But the answer is disturbingly simple. Because goodness exposes corruption. A person who has descended into malevolence cannot tolerate the presence of someone who is striving toward what is right. Why? Because it reminds them of what they have abandoned. It confronts them with their own inadequacies, their own failures, their own cowardice. And rather than face that reality, rather than take the difficult path of self-examination and correction, they choose instead to attack the source of their discomfort. They attack righteousness itself. This is why some people go beyond mere indifference to goodness and instead actively work to tear it down. They ridicule virtue. They mock morality. They resent those who try to live by a higher standard. They accuse them of being naive, of being foolish, of being oppressive. They invert the moral structure itself, convincing themselves that what is good is actually dangerous and that what is corrupt is actually enlightened. It's an upside-down way of looking at the world, and it's incredibly seductive because it provides justification for wrongdoing. If goodness is oppressive, then rebellion against goodness becomes a moral duty. If righteousness is an illusion, then vice becomes an act of freedom. That's the kind of rationalization that leads societies and individuals into catastrophic failure. You can see this process play out in history, time and time again. Entire revolutions have been built on the premise that what is good is actually the enemy, that tradition, structure, and virtue must be destroyed in order to create something better. But what follows is always the same: ruin, chaos, and suffering. You cannot tear down the foundation of morality without consequence. It doesn't work. It has never worked. But this doesn't just happen on the large scale. It happens in individual lives as well. If a person convinces themselves that morality is nothing more than a construct, that truth is subjective, that righteousness is an obstacle rather than an ideal, then they are capable of justifying anything. And once you can justify anything, you are one step away from absolute destruction of yourself and of those around you. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. The hatred for righteousness is not passive. It doesn't just sit quietly in the background. It seeks to spread. A person who resents goodness cannot stand to be alone in that resentment. They need validation. They need others to join them in their contempt. That's why people like this seek to corrupt others. It's not enough for them to reject morality. They want others to reject it too. They mock the disciplined because they don't want to feel inferior in comparison. They ridicule the faithful because faith reminds them of their own emptiness. They drag others down because standing beside someone striving for righteousness is unbearable. It highlights everything they lack. So what do? They attack. Not openly, at least not at first, but through whispers, through manipulation, through subtle encouragement toward vice. They offer temptation not because they want to share pleasure, but because they want to share guilt. They want to make sure no one around them remains good, because if no one is good, then they don't have to feel bad about being bad. This is why people who reject righteousness don't simply ignore it. They fight against it. They work to dismantle it, to erase it, to rewrite it. They use sophisticated arguments, moral relativism, and social pressure to convince others that the pursuit of virtue is foolish, outdated, even oppressive. They make righteousness seem unattainable, unnecessary, or even dangerous. And once they've done that, they can justify anything. But here's the truth. Goodness is not weakness. Righteousness is not an illusion, and morality is not oppression. In fact, those who despise these things, those who work to destroy them, are revealing far more about themselves than they realize. They are revealing their own failures, their own regrets, their own inability to live up to the standard they so desperately wish would disappear. And so the question becomes, what do you do? What do you do when you encounter this kind of resentment toward righteousness? The answer is difficult but necessary. You stand firm. You do not apologize for striving toward what is good. You do not cower in the face of mockery or contempt. You do not abandon your pursuit of truth just because others find it inconvenient. Because here's the reality. If you let those who hate goodness define the rules, you will wake up one day in a world where goodness no longer exists. And that is a world you do not want to live in. Hold fast, speak truth, defend what is right, because if you don't, no one else will. There's something fundamentally destructive about the kind of person who isn't content with their own corruption, who isn't satisfied with merely engaging in malevolence themselves, but instead feels compelled to bring others into the same darkness. That's a deeply sinister trait. And it reveals something essential about the nature of evil itself. It isn't static. It spreads. It recruits. It seeks to drag down everything good, noble, and pure, not because it has any real ambition of its own, but because it cannot tolerate the existence of something better. When a person has truly given themselves over to corruption, they don't want to be alone in it. They want validation. They need justification. And they accomplish that by corrupting others. If they can convince those around them to engage in the same destructive behavior, they no longer have to wrestle with their own conscience. After all, if everyone is doing it, then it must not be that bad. And if they can push people who were once good, once disciplined, once principled into the same chaos, they can tell themselves that goodness was never real to begin with. That's what malevolence does. It works in whispers and nudges. It starts with small compromises, justifications for behaviors that seem at first harmless enough. A person who has fully embraced corruption won't try to destroy someone outright. They won't immediately push them into some egregious act of wickedness. That's not how it works. Instead, they'll plant little seeds of doubt, erode the person's moral framework bit by bit, until eventually what was once inconceivable becomes inevitable. You see this with people who mock virtue and discipline. They don't just dismiss those who try to live by a higher standard. They actively work to tear them down. Why? Because seeing someone strive for righteousness is a painful reminder of their own failure. It shines a light on everything they lack. And rather than using that as motivation to improve, they attack the source of their discomfort. They make goodness seem foolish. They make discipline seem oppressive. They make faith seem delusional. They turn everything upside down, convincing those around them that abandoning virtue is not only acceptable, but necessary. There's an old saying that misery loves company, but this goes far beyond misery. This is corruption demanding company. This is destruction that cannot be satisfied with just its own decay. It must spread. It must consume. It must take down anything and anyone who threatens to reveal it for what it truly is. And this is where things get really dangerous. Because once a person starts pulling others down, they gain momentum. It becomes a habit. It becomes a way of life. And soon they're not just influencing individuals. They're influencing entire groups, entire systems, entire cultures. You can see this in institutions that lose their, you can see this in societies that abandon their moral compass. The rot doesn't happen overnight. It starts with small compromises, with little justifications, with the slow erosion of standards. And before you know it, everything has collapsed and no one can even remember what was lost. A truly corrupt person understands that once they convince others to abandon their principles, those people become easier to control. People without a moral framework are lost. They have no foundation, they have no center. And when you strip someone of their values, their principles, their sense of right and wrong, they become vulnerable to manipulation. They become weak, and weak people are easy to bend, easy to use, easy to push in whatever direction suits those in power. That's why standing firm in the face of corruption is so critical, because once you give in even a little, it doesn't stop. It never stops. The moment you compromise your integrity to fit in, to avoid conflict, to make things easier, you've already lost. Because the people who seek to corrupt you will never be satisfied with just one compromise. They'll push for more and more until there's nothing left of the person you used to be. So what's the solution? It's simple, but it's not easy. You refuse to bend. You refuse to be pulled down. You refuse to let someone else's corruption become your own. That means standing firm when it would be easier to give in. That means holding on to your principles even when it makes you unpopular. That means recognizing the tactics of those who seek to corrupt you and rejecting them outright. Because make no mistake, if you let yourself be pulled into that darkness, you will not be the same person on the other side. And the people who dragged you down, they won't respect you. They won't admire you. They'll despise you. Because deep down, they know what they've done. And deep down, they know they've taken something from you. The only way to win this battle is not to fight it on their terms. Don't play the game. Don't negotiate with corruption. Don't let those who have abandoned virtue convince you to do the same, because the moment you do, you've already lost. There's something deeply unsettling about a person who thrives on chaos. Someone who doesn't just stumble into disorder, but actively cultivates it. This isn't just someone who struggles with personal failures or who occasionally falls into destructive habits. No, this is someone who delights in watching the structures of meaning, truth, and stability crumble around them. There's something almost predatory about it. And it's not just because they reject order, it's because they need others to reject it too. A person like this is not content to be lost on their own. They want company in their descent. They see someone who has built their life on discipline and integrity, and instead of using that as inspiration, they seek to unravel it. They want to watch others fall into the same pit they're in. And they do this not out of some genuine belief that disorder is superior to order, but because the existence of order is a direct challenge to the way they've chosen to live. They cannot bear to be reminded that another way is possible, because that reminder forces them to confront their own inadequacies. So what do? They undermine, they mock, they chip away at the foundations of meaning itself. If you believe in something higher than yourself, whether it's truth, morality, or responsibility, they will try to convince you that such things are naive, oppressive, or even dangerous. They don't just reject these ideals for themselves. They want them destroyed for everyone. Because if they can convince you to abandon order, then they no longer have to feel threatened by your success, by your stability, by your ability to navigate the world with purpose. And make no mistake, this isn't just about personal choices. This is something that happens at every level of society. The destruction of order, of responsibility, of structure. It's celebrated in certain circles as a form of liberation. But liberation from what exactly? From meaning, from stability, from the very things that make life bearable? There's a profound arrogance in the belief that one can destroy without consequence, that one can unravel the structures of order and truth without paying a terrible price. People who take this path convince themselves that they're dismantling something oppressive, that they're tearing down constraints that hold them back. But what happens when you remove structure? What happens when you remove the framework that gives life direction? You don't get freedom, you get chaos. You get suffering, you get despair. A person who embraces chaos may claim that they're acting in the name of personal freedom, but that's not true. Real freedom requires responsibility. It requires self-discipline. It requires a commitment to something beyond your own immediate gratification. But these people reject all of that. And when someone else refuses to join them, they don't respond with indifference, they respond with hostility. Because here's the truth. Deep down, they know that what they're doing is wrong. They know that their choices are leading them into destruction. And they don't want to face that reality. So instead, they seek to pull others down with them, not because they care about those people, but because misery demands company. This is why you must be vigilant. You must recognize these patterns before they take hold in your own life. Because the temptation to fall into chaos is real. It's always there. It whispers that discipline is too hard, that responsibility is too much, that morality is outdated. And if you listen to that voice for too long, you will find yourself in a place you never intended to be. The people who work to destroy order don't do it all at once. They do it in small ways. They encourage indulgence over restraint. They celebrate weakness instead of strength. They make cynicism seem more intelligent than faith. And step by step, they lead others down a path that ends in ruin. So what's the solution? It's simple, but it's not easy. You refuse to participate. You refuse to be pulled into their games. You refuse to let their mockery, their cynicism, their contempt for order shake your foundation. And that means standing up for something real. It means committing yourself to discipline, to responsibility, to truth, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. Because here's the hard reality. If you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. And the people who embrace chaos, they're counting on that. They're counting on you to be too weak, too uncertain, too afraid to resist. But you don't have to be. You can choose a different path. You can choose to build something instead of tearing it down. You can choose to create meaning instead of destroying it. And in doing so, you become something truly rare in this world. A person who stands firm when everything else is falling apart. And that is the only real antidote to chaos. There's something profoundly unsettling about a person who is incapable of genuine love. And I don't mean love in the fleeting, romanticized way that people often talk about it. I mean real love. The kind that requires responsibility, sacrifice, and devotion to something beyond the self. The absence of this capacity is not just a minor flaw in character. It is a fundamental failure of the soul. Because to be incapable of love is to be incapable of connection, of loyalty, of genuine human flourishing. And when a person lacks this, they do not simply drift through life detached and indifferent. No, far worse than that. They become a force of destruction. When a person cannot love, they compensate in predictable ways. They pursue power. They pursue control. They manipulate. Because love is about giving, about investing in the well-being of another. But if you strip that away, what remains? The need to dominate. The need to possess, the need to tear down rather than build up. A person who lacks love sees others not as fellow human beings, but as objects, tools, means to an end. They do not care about people as individuals with dreams and struggles and pain. Instead, they see them as things to be used, discarded or destroyed. And that is an incredibly dangerous way to approach the world. Because once you start seeing others as objects, there is no limit to what you can justify. This is where true malevolence begins. Because a person who lacks love is not just indifferent to suffering, they are drawn to it. They enjoy it. They take pleasure in the pain of others because it makes them feel powerful. It makes them feel in control. And this isn't just theoretical. You see this in history. You see this in relationships. You see this in institutions that lose their moral center. The absence of love does not produce neutrality. It produces cruelty. And you might think, well, surely such a person can still have relationships. Yes, but not real ones. They mimic love. They counterfeit it. They use charm, persuasion, and manipulation to get what they want. But there's no warmth behind their words. No sincerity in their actions, Every interaction is transactional. What can I get from you? How can I use you? And once they've extracted what they need, they move on, leaving behind a wake of broken people who thought mistakenly that they were dealing with someone capable of genuine care. But here's the terrifying part. People like this are often incredibly good at hiding what they are. They can seem charismatic, they can seem intelligent, even kind. They know how to say the right things, how to play the role they need to play in order to get ahead. But beneath the surface, there is nothing but emptiness. And when the mask slips, when their true nature is revealed, it's often too late for those who trusted them. This is why you must be careful. You must watch for the sign. You must recognize when someone does not form real bonds, when they treat relationships as means to an end, when they lack empathy, when they derive pleasure from control rather than connection. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And if you ignore it, if you pretend it isn't there, you will pay the price. And here's the brutal truth. You cannot fix a person like this. You cannot love them into being better, because love requires a willingness to receive it. And if a person has hardened themselves against love, if they have chosen power, dominance, and cruelty instead, then no amount of kindness will change them. In fact, they will see your kindness as weakness. They will use it against you. They will take everything you give and leave you empty. So what do? You protect yourself. You set boundaries. You do not let yourself be drawn in by their charm, by their false promises, by the illusion of connection. You recognize that not everyone is redeemable, that some people through their own choices have become something truly dangerous. And you stand firm. You refuse to play their game. You refuse to be manipulated. You refuse to let someone incapable of love convince you that you are unworthy of it. Because here's the thing, there are people who do love. There are people who do care, who do build rather than destroy. And those are the people you must seek. Those are the people you must align yourself with. Because the alternative, it's a slow descent into a world where nothing is real, where everything is a game, where you are nothing more than a pawn in someone else's quest for power, and that is not a world you want to live in.